The most gruesome injuries in UFC history. Mixed martial arts is undoubtedly one of the most violent sports in the world, so it doesn't come as a surprise that the UFC has witnessed many gut-wrenching injuries over the years. From broken legs to damaged retinas, join us in this video as we explore 5 of the most horrifying injuries ever sustained inside the UFC's octagon. Anderson Silva, snapped tibia. Anderson Silva had been on top of the world for 6 years after claiming the UFC's middleweight title back in 2006 by finishing Rich Franklin with a brutal knee. Silva would go on to defend the title 10 times during his prime and seemed unstoppable. That was until Chris Weidman shocked the world by finishing him at UFC 162. The MMA community was stunned when Weidman dethroned Silva. However, considering he'd been the champion for nearly 7 years, the UFC quickly arranged a rematch between the pair and penciled it in for UFC 168. When they finally met inside the octagon, no one could have imagined how this fight would finish. Not long into the second round, Silva threw one of his trademark kicks that Weidman superbly blocked. However, as the spider's leg connected with his opponent's shin, his leg folded off to the side in a horrific fashion, a sight fans would never forget. This resulted in a clean break of the Brazilian shin and an injury that would keep him out for over 2 years. When Silva finally returned, he was never the same, going 1 for 7 in his next 8 fights. It was truly a career-ending injury. Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, broken arm. Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira was set to take on the beast that is Frank Mir at UFC 140. This would be the second time the pair met inside the UFC's octagon, following their title fight back at UFC 92, where Mir finished Big Nog via TKO. Both fighters were looking to earn themselves one last shot at the title and knew that a win could propel them to the #1 contender spot. So when the pair finally met inside the octagon, it was all to fight for. Halfway through the first round, Mir managed to lock in a Kumara on his opponent after a scrappy grappling encounter on the ground. Big Nog did his best to hold off the attack, but there's only so much pressure the arm can take before it snaps, and unfortunately for Nog, it did. Nogueira's arm bent to such an unnatural angle that it snapped before he decided to tap. The injury was one of the worst arm breaks we had ever seen in the UFC up to that point. While initial reports suggested he wouldn't need surgery, this was not the case. It was later revealed that Big Nog suffered a complete fracture to his humerus, an injury that would require him to have 16 screws inserted into his arm during surgery. But he wouldn't be out for long. Nogueira made a full recovery and returned to the octagon just 8 months later. Mark Hominick, gigantic hematoma. One of the most gruesome injuries on our list occurred back at UFC 129, when Mark Hominick took on the unstoppable Jose Aldo. Hominick had been on an impressive 5-fight win streak and did enough to prove to the UFC he should be Aldo's first title defense in the promotion. Both fighters had recently joined the UFC when the promotion acquired the WEC back in 2011, and this was set to be a contender for Fight of the Year. The pair put on a hell of a show that lasted for the full 5 rounds. Hominick showed great heart throughout the fight, despite taking a beating in the early rounds. He went on to find form in the 5th and almost took Aldo's title from him. But the challenger had taken serious damage to his head throughout the fight. So much so that fans began noticing a tennis ball-sized hematoma forming on the side of his skull. The referee of the fight was none other than Big John McCarthy, who had momentarily stopped the fight to allow the doctor to examine the blood bubble on the side of Hominick's head. Both agreed that the fight should continue, so the pair returned to business until the end of the 5th round. However, by this point, Hominick's hematoma was so large that even the most hardened of fans began feeling a little squeamish. Following his loss, fans couldn't help but praise Hominick for continuing to fight even though he was in excruciating pain. Considering he was almost the first to end Aldo's unbeaten streak, this fight would be remembered for a long time to come. Hominick will go down in history as a fighter who fought through one of the worst injuries we've ever seen in the UFC. Michael Bisping, detached retina. We all know the former middleweight champion Michael Bisping as a warrior who overcame adversity when he finally accomplished his goal of claiming UFC gold back at UFC 199. But what makes his legacy even more impressive is the fact that he did this with one eye. I guess you can already see where this is going. Yes, Bisping did in fact lose his eye inside the octagon a few years before becoming champion. The horrifying injury occurred when he faced off against Vitor Belfort in 2013. Title shot. Bisping looked sharp in the first round, but it would not turn out to be his night, stopping him instantly. He followed this up with a flurry of ground strikes. Not only did this end the fight, but unfortunately for Bisping, the kick connected with his eye socket, damaging his left retina in the process. While he was initially hopeful that surgery could repair the damage, later problems arose and the only option he was left with was to remove the eyeball altogether. Doctors advised Bisping to retire following the horrific injury, but as we all know, this was not the end of his story. At the time, Belfort was on testosterone replacement therapy, a procedure that the UFC would later outlaw. To this day, Bisping claims this played a role in the loss of his eye and claims it could all have been avoided if, using his own words, Belfort wasn't a cheating pussy. Chris Weidman, broken leg. Chris Weidman met Uriah Hall inside the octagon back at UFC 261 in 2021. A long way from his prime, Weidman was attempting to earn one last shot at reclaiming the middleweight title he lost to Luke Rockhold 6 years ago. When the pair met inside the octagon, fans and pundits assumed we were in for a great fight between two aging performers. And in agony, fans watching in the front rows of the arena witnessed Weidman's leg completely snap in two. It was one of the worst injuries in recent years. Spectators were instantly reminded of the night back at UFC 168, when Weidman had watched Silva's leg flop around after successfully blocking a low kick. Now, he had to endure the pain himself. Weidman underwent several surgeries after this horrific break and even had to get a titanium rod implanted in his leg. While many thought this would have been enough to force him to retire, considering he was now in his mid to late 30s, the former champion is set to return this August at UFC 292. Bonus injury: Jon Jones fractured toe. Jon Jones was set to face off against Chael Sonnen at UFC 159. The young Jones was only 25 years old at the time and had already been champion for 2 years. On the other hand, Sonnen was an aging 36-year-old who some considered a respectable journeyman. His Ultimate Fighter series, so tensions had already been building in the months before the fight. Jones would go on to dominate Sonnen, finishing him by way of TKO in the first round, greatly humbling Sonnen in the process. However, what most fans did notice until the end of the post-fight interview with Joe Rogan was that Jones had brutally dislocated his toe during the fight. During the interview, it was clear that the adrenaline that came along with the fight had started to wear off, and Jones was now in excruciating pain. Rogan went on to say, "You are a true champion for even attempting to make this work while you deal with one of the nastiest foot injuries I've ever seen." While it looked horrible, the fractured toe, later diagnosed as a dislocation, would only require Jones to sit on the sidelines for around 6 weeks. And that's our video on 5 of the most gruesome injuries in UFC history. Let us know what you think of the injuries and whose recovery you were most impressed with in the comments section. If you'd like to see more videos like this each week, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, MadAboutMMA. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.